welcome to the video series, Lovers of God. My name is Paul Breathen, and I'd like to start with the question that I asked you in the previous video. Do you hunger and thirst after God? Has your religious experiences in the past, prayer life, worship, reading the Bible, going to church, being in ministry, using your gifts that God has given you, have you found them that they no longer seem to be working? You find yourself continuing to be hungry, and God seems to be absent from you. It's a feeling like you're in a dry place, and you're wondering, why? Why? Where is God? What's going on? Is it something that I've done? Is perhaps maybe sin in my life? Well, I want to let you know that this is a good thing. It doesn't feel good, but it's a good thing. It means that God wants to captivate your attention. He wants to draw you to a higher place with Him. And so I'm here to share this journey with you and to talk about what is it that God wants to do in your heart and in your soul and in your life that seems to be a crossroads right now, that you're struggling. And so I want to set a foundation and start with an understanding of what is relationships. Because based on this, you'll help build bit by bit, piece by piece, a greater understanding of what it means to be in relationship with the Father, with others, and with yourself. So let's start with a paradigm. This is what I call a relationship paradigm. And what this is a description of how relationships function. I mean, how do we deal with one another in relationships, and what forces are at play that cause relationships to either thrive or to have problems and become dysfunctional? And so I want to share with, first of all, that if you think of a pyramid or a triangle, there are four elements that make up a relationship. You have love, you have good, evil, and will. And before I get into the details of each of these, I need to first share with you that these forces or elements are consistent or constant within nature. So I have what we call a divine equation in nature. And to better understand this, if you think of physics, and you have Albert Einstein, of course, who is a famous physicist who came up with the equation for energy, which is energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. And that, because of his discovery, we're now able to understand how atomic energy works. Of course, there's an atomic bomb, but we also have nuclear fusion. We have energy that we can have access to, that we can thrive on. But the point I want to make is that in physics, there are laws that are set, unchangeable, and that you can count on. In fact, you can rest assured that they'll never change. And I need to say that a relationship paradigm, what I want to talk about, is of similar mind, of similar thinking. It's consistent. Maybe to better understand this a little bit simpler, with Isaac Newton, who was the one who described the nature and law of gravity. And the idea that whether it's true or not, that the apple fell on his head, and he had this awareness about gravity, that all things fall to the earth. But the point is that, again, it's consistent. Same thing with this paradigm. And so if you had to come up with an equation, it would be something similar to this. The relationships equal good, love, evil, and will. Kind of like the glue that holds relationships together. And so this is a consistent paradigm. Now, to take this a little bit further, if you think of this, again, as forces of nature or like domains that govern relationships, let me talk a little bit about they're constant within creation. So this means that it not only applies to relationships between ourselves and human beings, but it's also a fixed paradigm within the spiritual realm. Our relationship with God also involves love, good, and evil and will. And spiritual beings, so whether they're angels or other spiritual beings that we may not be aware of, this is consistent in all relationships from the beginning of creation till currently. So, let me explain a little bit about love. Now, we think of love as often an emotion and feelings. And yes, they do have emotions and feelings. But the core of love is really two people, when they come and they meet, is their ability to connect. So, love is about connection. It's about union. And when you find someone that you're able to have this connection, of course, then there are feelings that come with that. And often we, again, associate that with love. So if you meet someone and you have overwhelming feelings of happiness and joy and butterfly feelings in your stomach and you're excited, that's because you've made a connection. And the greater that connection, the more profound it is between two people. Often we think of relationships that begin as infatuation. And we talk about how wonderful that is when two people meet, and it's almost intoxicating. It's like a drug. It's so powerful. And then we say, well, give it some time and the infatuation will wear off. And what really happens is that at some point in the relationship, whether it's within a few days or a few months, something happens. And what happens is a threat to the relationship. Says something, someone does something, and all of a sudden you go, oh, this person isn't who I thought they were, or this threatens me, and then the wall goes up, there's a disconnection, and when the disconnection occurs, the emotions stop, the feelings subside, or they minimize. And this is what we often say, that you lose infatuation, that love is now something you have to work at. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, because it's important to understand connection. But just to know that love is that ability for two people, whether it's with God or with one another, it's this connection, this union. Now moving on to goodness or good. Good is the ability, and there's many descriptions of what good is. I just have two here about being loyal, honest. It could be about your ability to do good and kindness, consider other people before yourself when it comes to your desires and needs. But the idea of goodness are those things that you do that maintain connection with love. That's the important thing to understand. Is out of goodness comes a connection, which then equals into the ability to thrive in relationships. So those two are strongly connected. On the other side, is we have evil. And of course, evil would be the opposite of goodness. There's a contrast there. So I have betrayal and unfaithfulness, and there's a whole other list of evil things that we do that break connection to love. So whether it's lying, cheating, hatred, murder, that's the ultimate, but all of those elements bring one thing, and that is death to the connection of love. Goodness brings life to the connection of love. One of the things that, when you first see this paradigm, when you use the word good and evil, people have a strong reaction to those words, especially today, and especially around probably evil. It's like it's just too strong of a word. There's a lot of religious connotations with that, with feeling judged and abused, and people kind of minimize the idea of evil. Some people don't even believe in evil. Okay? They believe in goodness, and I'll get into that again a little bit later. But those two elements, and I decided to keep those words because I don't think any other words can have as much definition and intent as good and evil, as opposed to light and dark, or healthy behavior versus unhealthy behaviors. So I want to stick with the good and evil, and you'll see as we move along how powerful really those terms fit into this paradigm. And of course, the last one, which is the will, has to do with being intentional, the freedom to choose. And notice that it's in the middle between the other three triangles of love, good, and evil. And it's important. And the thing, what will is the ability to choose between good, evil, and love. Without those three elements, will could not exist. It would have nothing to choose from. And so it's in the middle. It's kind of like the driver's seat of these four elements when it comes to you as an individual, and you have freedom, and that freedom must exist in order to have authentic relationships. But it's within the boundaries of good, evil, and love. And so now you have these four elements that make up this paradigm of a relationship. Now, let me talk a little bit about how this manifested itself in the Garden of Eden. Let's start from the beginning. So you have God who created all things on earth. He created the garden. He created Adam and Eve. And they were there in the garden. It said that they had fellowship together. They walked together. They talked. God educated them. God shared with them. There was a union. There was an unhindered connection. And God says, put them in charge of taking care of the garden. He said you can eat from any tree within the garden except for the one in the middle, which is really representing the choice between, you might say, good and evil. He says, the day you eat of this fruit, you will surely die. And so there was the ability to have a choice. And of course, if they were obedient to God, and they weren't, or they were willing to commit to his commandment and not eat of the fruit, that is a form of goodness. And of course, if they eat the fruit, it's a form of betrayal or evil that did bring a death to the relationship between man and God. And it's interesting that prior to that happening, Satan, who represents the opposite of God or evil, tempted Adam and Eve to eat the fruit. And he said, after they explained what the tree of evil of the fruit was, he says, you wouldn't die. Don't worry, you won't die. The day that you eat of that, you will become like God, knowing good and evil. Of course, they ate of the fruit, and their eyes were opened, and they realized what they had done. But I think for now, it's just important to know that in all relationships, you have these four elements. You have love, good, and evil that's at play. And they're consistent and constant within all of creation and all relationships. And so I'm going to end right here, and we'll continue in the next video to understand a little bit more about this paradigm of relationships.